Hello everyone. This lecture is on communication and governance in colonial India. It is a part of your paper on media, culture and society. This lecture intends to engage with media technologies introduced during the colonial Indian period. These technologies were used for governance purpose, but the institutions of governance created a gap between the colonialist and the natives. These natives, on the contrary, use these modern means and existing means to counter the colonial oppression and power. The present lecture would like to argue that technologies may not always be in the possession of the powerful. It may equally be used to counter any oppressive regime. In this lecture, you will learn that communication technologies that were introduced in the colonial Indian period are meant for strategic purpose and effective governance. These technologies were created for the public but maintained a discrete distance between the colonialist and the native. The idea behind introducing technology was less a development mission and more a legitimation of the empire. This lecture will elaborate two crucial aspects of colonial communication, that is, communication and the art of governance, and communication and the art of resistance. Communication and the art of governance. Professor Yogendra Singh argues that communication constitutes a strategic aspect of governance and administration in all societies. He said that efficacy and viability of the administrative processes derive their legitimacy not only from projection of power, but also from the nature of the cultural responses that its structures, norms, and goals received from the society under governance. In the colonial context in which many such societies were ensnared, communication became for the many intellectuals from these countries an ideology of revolutionary social and political movement for the emancipation from the foreign rule. Professor Singh further added that India had its own traditional institutions of governance, but colonial rule introduced a major challenge to these institutions. Colonial regime made innovative contributions in the realm of communication as well. The technologically innovative contributions were primarily prompted by the scientific discoveries of Industrial Revolution and its interface with governance. The introduction of radio and other electronic media of mass communication reinforced this interface with governance. The overriding intention behind strengthening of communication by the colonial state was the effective and efficient governance of the society for colonial mode of appropriation and exploitation of its natural and human resources. C.A. Bailey, in Empire and Information, illustrates strategic aspect of communication in governance and administration in detail. He argues that the introduction of modern technology of communication, such as print media, was overall a part and parcel of the process of governance. But Bailey stated that European colonial states faced obvious problems in engaging with the information order of a conquered society, an essential task if they were to build an intelligence system capable of securing their grip on the territory's resources. The conquerors needed to reach into and manipulate the indigenous systems of communication in these new colonies. By this, the colonial streamlined the traditional networks of communication for managing the information. Bailey states that the indigenous systems of communication were so diverse and different from each other that colonial regime had to preside over a wide and differing information order. The basic fear of the colonial official or settler was his lack of indigenous knowledge and ignorance of the wilds of the native. They faced difficulties with the language as well, making them dependent on the skills of the translators who were drawn from the communities which the colonials sought to dominate. This substantiates the argument that the colonial rule could not have been sustained and legitimized without a certain degree of understanding the cultures of conquered societies. And the new means of communication, which are drastically different from the previous, were working in the direction of providing legitimacy and sustenance to the empire. The empire used varied strategies to maintain their order. The management of communication was essential, leading to the formation of a well-coordinated bureaucratic system. This bureaucratic system depended on an efficient system of communication and intelligence. Anti-colonial struggles, the rebellion of 1857 being the most remarkable, were catalyst in shaping and reshaping of this bureaucratic structure and communicational apparatus of the colonial India. The modern means of transportation and communication played a key role in consolidation of the empire. Their contribution in forging the Indian people into a nation is also noteworthy. The necessity of bringing a single political administrative system stimulated the construction of railways, modern roads, and established the post and the telegraph systems. The military strategic reasons also motivated the introduction of a modern transport system. Dan and Chaudhary stated that the initial advocates for developing railways were mercantile firms in London and Manchester with trading concerns in India. The expectation was that railways would lower transport costs and allow English merchants easier access to raw cotton from India. Simultaneously, railways would also open the Indian markets to British manufactured products such as cotton textiles. Communication and the art of resistance. There existed a tension between the colonial administrative discourse of communication and the emerging nationalist discourse oriented towards the freedom from colonial rule. People of India were resisting the colonial domination in various capacities. They organized themselves to revolt against the colonial domination. These struggles required communication across regions. There is an interesting history of cultural methods of communication that were employed by people to mobilize against the domination. Menon stated that the revolt of 1857 was a striking example of communication across vast distances and the coming together of people from very different backgrounds and consciousness. P.C. Joshi's edited book Rebellion 1857 cites many anonymous narratives of the Indian Mutiny, describes the form of communication as the way the spirit of revolt was spread amongst the soldiers. It also establishes that culture as communication implies context that will guide the nature of communication and its inherent message. The Santhal rebellion of colonial time was demonstrating the speed of symbolic markers used by tribals and peasants to expand and speed up the range of rebellion. A branch of the sal tree was circulated among peasants and tribals, signifying the symbolic form of communication specific to pre-industrial culture, conveying instructions about revolts. Ranjit Guha reflected on the methods of transmission. He highlighted that the beating of the drum or the blowing of a horn or a flute could be very powerful vehicles of communication, especially when colonial authorities were culturally alien. Therefore, it was not easily comprehensible by the colonial authorities. Also, these methods had additional advantage of permitting decoding of messages directly rather than through language. They enabled mobilization on a much larger scale, going beyond those who spoke the same language. Nationalist leaders also used various communicative methods to organize people. Many of them started their own newspapers and journals. In fact, newspapers played a decisive role in disseminating the nationalist ideas. Menon pointed that communication was important because the endeavor was to reach across vast distances and to bring together people from diverse backgrounds, with different languages, different food habits, different worldviews, different social attitudes, and different political levels, and different levels to political consciousness. Menon further added that anti-imperialism united the natives. They all faced the injustice and oppression of the British rule and saw before their eyes the weakening of the Indian economy and the Mercerization of the Indian people. The tension between the colonial and nationalist use of modern means of transportation and communication was visible in almost all domains of communication. The press had been subjected to censorship in the colonial time. The colonial government enacted a series of press acts of varying stringency which testify the decisive role played by the printing press in the development of a national consciousness against colonial rule. It became an indispensable weapon in the hands of rising social forces led by the intelligentsia. Bipin Chandra, in India's struggle for independence, elaborated the influence of the press which extended far beyond its literate subscribers. Nor was it confined to cities or large towns. A newspaper would reach remote villages and would then be read by a reader to 10 others. Gradually, library movements sprung up all over the country. A local library would be organized around a single newspaper. A table, a bench or two, and a charpai would constitute the capital equipment. Every piece of news or editorial comment would be read or heard or thoroughly discussed. The newspaper became the political educator. Reading it or discussing it became a form of political participation. The colonial rule is characterized by gagging laws on the freedom of press. They imposed several restrictions according to which any printing material needs to be submitted to the colonial authorities. During the reign of the British Empire, there were several acts passed as stringent curbs over the Indian press. Prior to the rumblings of the 1857 mutiny, the press was fiercely involved in rallying the masses, and inevitably, the British government was increasingly becoming apprehensive about the press freedom. Through the newspapers, a nationalistic rebellion was slowly being pieced together through words and symbols. In view of this, the Gagging Act was passed by Lord Lytton, which was driven to curtail and control the Indian publication content. The Act compelled all Indian publications to apply for a license from the government, while also ensuring that nothing was written against the British government, nor was the British government challenged in any measure. The Vernacular Press Act of the 1878 that came heavily on vernacular press as they were criticizing the colonial government in a very strong tone. If any newspaper dared to offend the colonial government and was unrepentant about it, had to face various restrictions such as postal privileges being suspended. At the same time, the censorship laws required the entire newspaper to be submitted to the pre-censorship. Censorship was first introduced in Madras in 1795, when the Madras Gazette was required to submit all general orders of government for scrutiny by the military secretary before its publication. Free postage facilities were also withdrawn. Similarly, Amrita Bazar Patrika was subjected to such gagging when it published reports on the exploitation of indigo farmers. The British government has used the sedition as one of the primary tools to suppress the nationalist struggle. It could label any printed material as seditious content to terrorize the revolutionaries and nationalists. The nationalist leaders traveled by train across regions to personally meet people and form public opinion. In fact, railways became one of the sites where the colonial domination was practiced and challenged. The persistence of the Raj in railways is evident in the hierarchy of first and third class, which then was furthered in the culinary hierarchy as well. Passengers in different classes of carriage had vastly different surroundings and treatment. Needless to say that the third class overwhelmingly contains the Indians experiencing humiliating conditions. They were also subjected to colonial surveillance. Since its inception, there were complaints regarding travelling conditions in the third class. Many of the letters to the editors published in newspapers were on such complaints. There were many petitions submitted to colonial authorities. The ill treatment meted out to Indian passengers by colonial employees such as station master guards, policemen and European travellers were frequently mentioned in such letters and petitions. In this lecture, you have read the role of communication and the art of governance during the colonial India. Along with the modern means of communication, the natives also explore alternate ways of resistance. Hence, communication may not be confined or located within any specific power structure. In fact, there are other ways to deal and counter the dominant power structure. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module. Thank you.